In 1504, a knight had his arm blown off by a cannon. Even today, it would be difficult for a person to survive such trauma, but this knight didn't even retire. He continued to fight, to feud, to serve several leaders with the help of an ingenious prosthetic, and to demonstrate that the romantic vision of a noble knight was far removed from a world where combat was brutal and causes were much more practical than noble. The astounding life of Gottfried von Berlingen, or Guts, of the Iron Hand, deserves to be remembered. Berlichingen was born in 1480 to a noble family in the county of Württemberg. He was the 10th child of Kilian and his wife Margaretha, and probably grew up at Jaxthausen Castle in the town of the same name. The castle, which still stands, is also called Gotzenburg. Gutz's father was a free imperial knight of the Holy Roman Empire, a class of knights who had imperial immediacy, meaning they owed allegiance only to the emperor, making them nobles equal to most titled individuals, although they were not represented in the imperial diet. Our primary historical reference for Gutz's life came from the man himself in an autobiography which should be read cautiously. At the age of 14, he became a squire to his father's cousin Conrad, knight and counselor to the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach. He served as a page for 3 years until Conrad's death in 1497. From there he entered the service of the Margrave himself. As a squire, he saw service in a campaign in Upper Burgundy under Maximilian I. Even at this young age, he proved to be rowdy, getting in a fight with a Pole at the court, and the first of his many feuds. He also served in a minor capacity in the Swabian War between the Holy Roman Empire and the old Swiss Confederacy. For a time, he joined up with robber knight Hans Talaker, also known as Hans the Black, capturing 11 rich peasants they sold for ransom. By 1502, he joined the Margrave in a conflict against Ansburg and Nuremberg, which culminated in a battle at the gates of Nuremberg. Combat of the era was shifting dramatically. While knights continued to serve on horseback as heavy cavalry, professional armies and the importance of the German pikemen called Langschnitt was growing, and gunpowder meant that firearms and cannons were a staple in all armies. In Gutz's account, he was positioned outside of Nuremberg with around 700 cavalrymen, along with 300 Landsknecht and 300 Swiss pikemen. The Nurembergians marched towards them with their cannon, their wagon forts, and their foot soldiers. The wagon forts, first popularized during the Hussite Wars, involved a series of wagons that would hook up to become a circular fort that gunmen could fire from. Gutz marched forward with the other men, the shots of the enemy cannon hitting in such mass that we could barely see through the smoke. Gutz reached the wagons before they could circle and killed the leading horse, which forced the wagon to halt. With typical humility, Gutz wrote that he did not know how this battle could have turned out any other way, if not for my actions. They were able to beat back the Nuremberg reinforcements and capture the wagon fort. In his autobiography, he relates another story where he got into a fight with a squire called the Affe. The Affe insulted him, and he chose to fight him. He chased the squire to a village where he knocked the man down. The Affe immediately begged the local villagers to help him, and for a moment, Guts was surrounded by villagers with boar spears, hand axes, throwing axes, wood axes, and stones. He barely managed to escape using his horse, but was wounded in the arm so hard it felt like it was cut in two. In 1504, a war broke out between the two duchies in southern Germany. The two duchies were Bavaria Munich and Bavaria Landshut, two lines of the House of Wittelsbach. A treaty from 1329 had stated that if one of the lines became extinct in the male line, the other would inherit, although this already broke imperial law, which had the emperor himself inherit extinct titles. When George, the Duke of Bavaria Landshut, had no male heir, he named his daughter Elizabeth instead, which led to war with the Duke of Bavaria. Gotz led troops in this war on the side of the emperor and the Bavarian duke, marching towards Landshut. It was in a battle on July 14th at Landshut that Gotz received a grave injury. According to his autobiography, while he was engaged in the battle, the Nurembergians turned their cannon against him and shot my sword pommel in two, so that half of it cut into my arm and into the bracers too. The pommel was so deep in the bracers that one could not see it anymore. The damage to his arm, along with the work of the surgeon, meant that Gotz lost his right hand. For months afterwards, Gotz struggled with the consequences of his injury. I begged God to be merciful and take me up to him, because I was now a ruined warrior, he wrote. He remembered, though, another knight who was missing a hand but could do everything he needed to do against his enemies on the battlefield. After he recovered, Gotz had a fairly crude metal hand made, supposedly by a local blacksmith, that allowed him to grip a sword, although for sword fighting he had to learn how to fight with his left hand. This was a fairly simple hand, painted to look like flesh, with fingers that could be set in several positions to hold reins or possibly a shield strap. Society was changing rapidly in the 16th century. New technologies like the printing press were invented. The power of the church was challenged with the Protestant Reformation, and patchwork feudal authority systems were breaking down in favor of stronger central monarchs and governments. Much of this would impact Guts of the Iron Hand. In 1495, Emperor Maximilian I had issued the Perpetual Peace, which banned the medieval right of vendetta or feuds. The lower nobility, such as Guts, had often gotten into feuds with other knights, cities, and governments over debts, disagreements, and insults. And once a feud began, the knight would write a letter to his target announcing the vendetta. It allowed for legal banditry to get back at foes and augmented small landholders' incomes. The Perpetual Peace ordered these claims of vendetta to be resolved in legal processes instead of in battle. And for knights like Guts, this was a challenge to their culture, and one that Guts himself ignored at will, as did many others. Guts would be engaged in one feud or another almost constantly for years after he lost his hand. Sometime around 1530, he had a second prosthetic hand made, this one much more impressive and generally considered a technical marvel of the time. Each finger could be bent at 3 points, while the thumb bent at 2. The hand itself was designed as an extension of his armor, and was so heavy that it had to be affixed directly to the armor with leather straps. It was in this time that one of the more colorful stories about Guts of the Iron Hand, although probably apocryphal, occurred. At one point, he set several places on fire to get the attention of one of his foes, and when an official berated him for the action, he said, "He can lick my ass." He was so famous for the line that his name became a euphemism for the expression, especially in southern Germany. It is also called the Swabian salute. He feuded with the Bishop of Bambara when one of his men was arrested, against the city of Cologne on behalf of a wronged acquaintance, with the city of Nuremberg for kidnapping one of his friends, and many, many more. At one point, he claimed that he was fighting 5 feuds at once. He acted often as a bandit, raiding wagons and traders that were under the protection of his enemies. In 1512, he and more than 100 horsemen attacked a merchant convoy headed to Nuremberg, which angered a half-dozen cities whose merchants were in the convoy. This became one of his worst offenses, as the emperor put him under an imperial ban. Under an imperial ban, he wasn't allowed to own any land or possessions and was considered legally dead. Anyone could kill or rob him without punishment. He had to pay 14,000 guilders in reparation and got the ban lifted only in 1514. Still, he continued to feud, at one point capturing the Count of Waldeck and extorting a ransom. In 1518, the emperor put him under a ban again. He served the Duke of Württemberg in a war with the Swabian League in 1519, where he defended a town against the Swabians. The town was besieged, and the enemy force eventually forced him to surrender the town. He negotiated free passage for his men on 11 May 1519, but he himself was arrested, or, according to another version of the story, wounded during a sortie. He remained imprisoned in Heilbronn for 3.5 years, largely thanks to his long-running feud with the League and its cities. He was forced to pay 2,000 gulden in reparations and to renounce feuds altogether. In 1515, with money from his various activities, he purchased Hornburg Castle in Neckar Valley, about 50 miles north of Stuttgart. When he was finally released by the Swabians in 1522, he seemed finally interested in settling down. By his own count, he had fought at least 15 feuds, not to mention the many feuds and fights of others that he had joined. At 42 years old, and with a string of bad luck and feuds behind him, he attempted to take it easy for a time. But alas, it was not to be. In 1524, one of the largest popular revolts in European history broke out across the German-speaking Central Europe. Experts disagree on the precise cause of the revolt, but considerable social change was pressing the peasant class. German princes and authorities had seized nearly all of the common land where peasants used to hunt and gather wood, had used Roman civil law to seize the peasants' land, and raised taxes. These actions also pressed the lesser nobility, men like Guts. The knights' incomes were ruined and their estates seized by the more powerful princes, and their importance as heavy cavalry fell in the face of military advancements. This led to the Knights Revolt in 1522 and 23, in which members of the knight class attempted to win reform through battle, but the effort failed. Guts did not participate in the Knights Revolt, but he was affected by the same constraints. The lesser knights, who often made their money by the kind of banditry Guts was famous for, were pressed on all sides, with princes seeking greater control and the imperial permanent peace decree forcing them to squeeze their peasants to maintain their lifestyle. Finally, the printing press was allowing a greater dissemination of ideas. The Book of 100 Chapters, printed between 1501 and 1513, attacked the established hierarchy and advocated for economic and religious freedoms. During the harvest of 1524, the Countess of Lupfen ordered serfs to collect snail shells, which are used as thread spools. The peasants outright refused, created a list of grievances, and elected leaders. Within days, the whole of southwest Germany, from the Black Forest into Bavaria, was in open revolt. By February of 1525, the revolt spread, with 25 villages belonging to the city of Memmingen demanding change in 12 articles, which became the basis for the Statement of Principles and the 12 Articles that the Upper Swabian Peasants' Confederation agreed on in March 1525. They printed the articles 25,000 times and spread them across Germany. The articles made significant demands, including the right for communities to choose and remove clergymen, and that the great tithe, which often took as much as 10% of the peasants' income, be used for public purposes. Peasants also wanted to be allowed use of common lands again, and an end to serfdom, and restrictions on excessive taxes and labor demands. The spring of 1525 saw the peasants form armies to fight the aristocrats. A large band formed in the Neckar Valley, where Gutz's castle was, and seized the Weinsberg Castle, which had a depleted garrison. The Count of Helfenstein, along with 70 other nobles, were executed by the band, an act so vicious that the captain of the band was deposed. The band, calling itself the Bright Band, approached his castle, 12,000 strong, armed with artillery and handguns. According to Gutz, he wanted to serve the aristocrats against the peasants and was sincerely fearful for his family. The peasants sent their captain to meet with Gutz, who answered out of fear of retribution if he did not, and he said the peasants had the devil in them. When Gutz learned that the peasants meant to make him their leader, he balked. "I shall not do it, and I will go to their leaders myself and tell them that I shall not be forced," he said. Yet, he says, a band of peasants threatened to kill his family if he refused. Further, he claimed that a group of princes and lords asked him to accept to prevent many injustices. Reluctantly, he accepted the position, though he also wrote that the peasants' behavior and mine were as far apart as heaven and earth. He only began agreeing with the peasants, he said, when he learned that they would cut off my head if I did not change my behavior. He agreed to lead them on April 24th. The peasant army marched on Würzburg, which surrendered quickly. Around 400 people, including 240 soldiers and some 20 knights, refused to surrender and held out in Marienburg Castle. The peasant army, numbering around 15,000, besieged the castle beginning on May 13th. On May 14th, the two sides dueled with their artillery, with the defenders getting the better of the peasants. Gutz ordered an assault on the castle for the night of the 15th. The poorly armored peasants stormed the castle, but the defenders fought back with boiling water, pitch, and handguns. Hundreds of peasants were killed and injured, but were repulsed from the castle. A mercenary army sent by the Swabian League forced the Bright Band to lift the siege on May 23rd. Gutz left the army on May 28th after 5 weeks. The band was destroyed shortly after. During his brief time, he had promulgated a new version of the 12 Articles, which weakened the demands of the 12 Articles, which earned him death threats from the rebels. After the revolt was put down, he was summoned before the imperial court to account for his actions. He claimed that he tried to rein in the peasants' worst behavior, though they pillaged and burned anyway. He was exonerated by the court on October 17, 1526. The Swabian League, however, who already disliked Gutz, was not as forgiving. The League seized him while he was traveling in 1528, and later that year threw him in jail in Augsburg, where he remained in prison for almost 2 years. He was released on an agreement to pay reparations, along with a 25,000 guilder fine. He was also sentenced to indefinite house arrest, not allowing him to leave his own lands. There is, of course, the possibility that all of his defenses were invented after the fact in order to save his own hide when the rebellion failed. His version of events is not unlikely, but it is possible, too, that Gutz had more sympathy for the peasants than he let on. For the rest of his life, he remained near his castle, leaving for extended periods only twice when he was ordered by the emperor. First in 1540, when he was ordered to serve Charles V's campaign against Suleiman the Magnificent in Hungary in 1542, and again in 1544, when England and the Empire invaded France. Gutz of the Iron Hand, who had fought in so many wars, so many battles, and so many feuds, who had lived by the sword, died in his sleep on July 23rd, 1562, at 81 or 82 years old. Gutz was the product of a violent time, but he also lived in a period of social transformation that would dramatically alter the way that people lived their lives in Europe. Knights as a class continued to decline as their usefulness in battle faded and professional armies and nation-states became the norm. He lived long enough to see his very way of life become an anachronism. But his life is an extraordinary story. Having lost his dominant arm, he continued to fight, to battle, to best men who had 2 good arms, and he became a folk hero of sorts. He might have been the inspiration for the character of Jaime Lannister in A Game of Thrones, and he was the subject of a play by Johann Wolfgang Goethe. During the Second World War, an SS division took his name, and their symbol was an iron hand. Today, both his castle and his boyhood home house museums. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.